For a long time, the story around desktop operating systems followed a simple pattern. Windows was the default, Linux was the alternative, and the debate revolved around which one was improving faster. New Linux releases were framed as catching up, while Windows updates were assumed to be progress by definition. But something subtle and important has happened over the past decade. Linux didn't suddenly leap forward in some dramatic revolutionary way. It didn't need to. Instead, Windows slowed down, became heavier, more complicated, more constrained, and more disconnected from the needs of everyday users. The shift we're seeing now isn't about Linux improving faster. It's about Windows falling behind in ways that are hard to ignore once you notice them. To understand this, you have to step away from marketing headlines and look at how people actually use their computers today. Most users want the same basic things they've always wanted. A system that boots quickly, doesn't get in the way, respects their time, runs their hardware efficiently, and lets them focus on their work or hobbies without constant interruptions. For years, Windows delivered that experience well enough that few people questioned it. Linux, on the other hand, was often seen as powerful but inconvenient, flexible but unfriendly. That reputation lingered for a long time, even as Linux quietly matured in the background. What changed wasn't that Linux suddenly became something entirely new. What changed was Windows' direction. Each new version added layers of abstraction, background services, online dependencies, and design choices that felt increasingly disconnected from the idea of a personal computer being truly personal. Updates that once felt like improvements began to feel like disruptions. Features users didn't ask for arrived bundled with features they couldn't easily remove. Control slowly shifted away from the person sitting at the keyboard and toward policies, services, and defaults decided elsewhere. Linux, meanwhile, stayed consistent in one crucial way. It remained centered around user control. That doesn't mean every Linux distribution is simple or perfect, but the underlying philosophy never changed. The system exists to serve the user, not the other way around. When Windows users talk about switching today, they often describe a sense of relief rather than excitement. Relief that their system is quiet again. Relief that updates happen when they choose. Relief that their computer feels like it belongs to them. One of the clearest signs that Windows fell behind is performance. Not raw benchmark numbers, but everyday responsiveness. On the same hardware, especially older or mid-range machines, Linux often feels faster, smoother, and more predictable. This isn't because Linux is magically optimized for every scenario. It's because it doesn't carry the same weight of background processes, telemetry services, and bundled applications running constantly. A Linux desktop can idle at a fraction of the resource usage of a modern Windows install. That difference adds up, especially on laptops, where battery life and thermal performance matter. There was a time when Windows was the obvious choice for compatibility. If you wanted software support, driver support, and a wide range of applications, Windows was the safe bet. That advantage has narrowed significantly. Web-based tools now dominate many workflows, and they run the same on any operating system with a modern browser. Cross-platform applications built with frameworks that target Linux, Mac OS, and Windows equally have become the norm rather than the exception. Even in areas like creative work and development, Linux support is no longer an afterthought. At the same time, Windows has introduced new barriers, hardware requirements that exclude perfectly capable machines. Online account mandates that turn a local computer into an extension of a cloud identity. Updates that can restart a system at the wrong moment. Notifications that feel more like ads than helpful information. Individually, each of these might seem minor. Together, they create friction. They make the system feel less reliable, less respectful, and less focused. Linux didn't need to catch up to that experience. It simply continued to offer an alternative that avoided those problems. You can install Linux on a decade-old laptop and have a responsive, modern-feeling system in under an hour. You can choose a desktop environment that matches your preferences, whether you want something minimal and fast or polished and feature-rich. You can decide how updates work, what runs in the background, and how much of the system is visible to you. Another area where Windows fell behind is stability. Not the dramatic kind of stability measured by crashes, but the quiet kind that comes from predictability. Windows updates have become a source of anxiety for many users. Will this update break something? Will it change my settings? Will it install features I don't want or remove ones I rely on? Linux distributions handle updates differently, And while no system is perfect, the process often feels more transparent. Changes are documented. Major upgrades are optional. Rolling release distributions let advanced users stay current without disruptive jumps, while long-term support releases provide years of consistency for those who value reliability over novelty. Security is another example where perception and reality have drifted apart. Windows is often described as more secure because it's widely used and heavily defended. In practice, its popularity also makes it a bigger target. Linux benefits from a different model. One where software is typically installed from trusted repositories rather than random installers downloaded from the web. Permissions are clearer. System-level changes require explicit authorization. Malware exists on Linux, but the attack surface is smaller for most desktop users, and the security model encourages good habits by default. The irony is that Linux didn't suddenly become user-friendly overnight. It improved gradually, steadily, without much fanfare. Installers became simpler. Hardware detection improved. Desktop environments became more polished. Documentation grew. Communities expanded. None of this was revolutionary in isolation. But while Linux was quietly refining its rough edges, Windows was adding new ones. Consider the user interface. Windows has changed its design language multiple times, sometimes within the same major version. Settings are split across old and new panels. Options are duplicated or hidden. Familiar workflows are replaced with redesigned ones that don't necessarily improve efficiency. Linux desktop environments, by contrast, offer choice. If you like a traditional layout, it's there. If you want something modern and minimalist, it's there. If you want to customize everything down to the smallest detail, you can. If you don't have to. This flexibility is often misunderstood as complexity. In reality, it's optional complexity. You can use Linux for years without touching a terminal, just as you can dive deep into system internals if you want to. Windows, on the other hand, increasingly hides complexity in ways that limit control rather than simplifying it. Advanced options are buried, locked down, or removed entirely, replaced by automated decisions that may not align with the user's needs. Gaming is frequently cited as the last major reason to stick with Windows, and for a long time, that argument made sense. Today, it's far less clear-cut. Thanks to compatibility layers and native support improvements, a huge portion of modern games run well on Linux. Performance is often comparable, sometimes even better, especially on systems where Windows overhead becomes noticeable. While not every game works perfectly, the gap has narrowed enough that many users no longer see gaming as a deal-breaker. The real shift, though, is psychological. People are re-evaluating their relationship with their computers. They're asking why their system needs constant internet connectivity to function properly. Why basic features require accounts and subscriptions. Why updates feel like a loss of control rather than an improvement. Linux doesn't answer all these questions perfectly, but it offers a different set of priorities. It treats the computer as a tool first, not a platform for services. That difference shows up in small, everyday moments. Booting up and being ready to work without waiting for background tasks to finish. Installing software without pop-ups or bundled extras. Customizing the system without registry hacks or third-party utilities. Knowing that if something breaks, you can usually see why and fix it rather than being left with vague error messages and automated troubleshooters. It's important to be honest here. Linux isn't for everyone, and it doesn't magically solve every problem. Some hardware still requires extra effort. Some professional software remains Windows only. Learning a new system takes time. But the fact that so many people are willing to make that switch anyway says something important. They're not chasing novelty. They're escaping frustration. Windows fell behind not because it stopped innovating, but because it innovated in directions that didn't always serve its users. It became more centralized, more controlled, more abstracted. Linux stayed decentralized, modular, and user-focused. The result is a reversal of expectations. Linux now feels refreshingly straightforward, while Windows feels increasingly complicated. If you asked users 10 years ago why they didn't use Linux, they might have mentioned drivers, software availability, or difficulty of use. Ask them today, and the answers are different. They talk about Windows updates breaking things, about unwanted features, about performance on older machines, about feeling like they no longer own their own computers. Linux didn't suddenly remove all its barriers. Windows built new ones. That's why the phrase Linux didn't improve. Windows fell behind resonates. It captures the quiet nature of this shift. There was no single moment, no dramatic turning point. Just a slow accumulation of decisions, each one small enough to justify, but together significant enough to change the balance. Linux remained what it always was at its core, a system built around user freedom and transparency. Windows moved toward something else. In the end, this isn't about declaring a winner. It's about recognizing a change in momentum. The desktop computing landscape is no longer defined by one obvious default and a niche alternative. People now choose their operating system based on values as much as features. Control versus convenience. Transparency versus abstraction. Stability versus constant change. Linux didn't need to reinvent itself to benefit from this shift. It just needed to keep being Linux. Windows, meanwhile, lost sight of what made it feel simple, dependable, and personal in the first place. And that's why, for the first time in a long while, the question isn't, why would anyone switch to Linux? It's, why wouldn't they, given where Windows is headed? That question lingers every time a user installs Linux on a machine they thought was too old to be useful, only to find it running smoothly again. Every time someone realizes they can set up their system exactly the way they want and keep it that way. Every time an update happens quietly in the background without demanding attention. These experiences don't feel revolutionary, they feel normal. And that's precisely the point. Linux didn't need to become extraordinary. It just needed to stay grounded while Windows drifted. In doing so, it exposed a gap that many users didn't even realize had opened. A gap between what a personal computer used to feel like and what it has become. Linux now occupies that space not because it raced ahead, but because it refused to leave it behind.